So, for the first time in 10 years, we're finally getting another proper Batman movie. Unless you count Batman v Superman and both versions of the Justice League movie, in which Batman plays a crucial role. Also, the Lego Batman movie. Also, Batman the Killing Joke from 2016, that got a theatrical release. Now that I think about it, there's been a bunch of animated Batman movies that have been released in the past 10 years. Also, Batman was in Suicide Squad, and Joker, of course, little Bruce Wayne was in it, and his parents get shot, which basically makes it a Batman movie. Also, Birds of Prey is about Harley Quinn and a bunch of other Batman-related characters. Also, the show Gotham and Batwoman and Pennyworth. Did you know they made a show about Alfred Pennyworth? You do now. And all those CW shows, I'm assuming Batman is in at least a few episodes. I know for a fact he's in that dark and gritty Teen Titans show. Also, probably a bunch of animated shows as well. But aside from all that, audiences have been starved of Batman. We haven't gotten a live-action, solo, theatrically released Batman movie that doesn't feature any other superheroes since The Dark Knight Rises, until now with the Batman. Let's talk about it.
Whoa! This guy's crazy!
Okay, up top, I'm going to discuss elements of the film that could be considered spoiler territory. But I think most of you have seen the film by now, and if you haven't, then I'm not sure how you came across this specific review by like an E-tier YouTube wannabe film critic, but I'm also guessing that since you still haven't seen the film yet, you don't really care about spoilers. So, like most people on the planet, I've been eagerly anticipating this movie. I love Batman, just like everyone else. I'm a big fan of Matt Reeves' directing work, with Cloverfield and the last two Planet of the Apes movies. The casting for this was really on point, especially with Robert Pattinson as Batman. He's an actor I've become a big fan of because of films like Good Time, The Lighthouse, and most recently Tenet. And the trailers for this movie looked phenomenally good. So I had pretty unreasonably high expectations going in. Especially with the reviews for this saying it was on par with, if not better than, The Dark Knight. And for me at least, it's not quite there. I did thoroughly enjoy this movie though, but it's not the greatest superhero movie ever made, as many people are saying. I still really liked it, and I'd say the quality is more on par with something like Batman Begins. So I definitely have a lot of hope for what the sequels could bring. What I loved about this movie, however, is just the pure aesthetic of it. It returns a real gothic style that Batman has been lacking recently. The film is still grounded in reality, even more so than the Nolan trilogy, but it still gets away with having a stylized setting. The interior design of Wayne Manor, for example, is just pure gothic architecture. It looks like the inside of a cathedral that was left untouched since the 1400s. Gotham itself not only looks, well, gothic, but also feels very cyberpunk with all the screens built over the top of these buildings and the fact that it always appears to be raining. Visually, whenever we see Bruce Wayne walking around the busy city streets at night, it looked very inspired by the first Blade Runner movie. Gotham has a distinctive look that we really haven't had in recent iterations. It's not just any city, it's grimy and dirty, and it looks and feels like the last place you'd ever want to be in. The cinematography by Greg Fraser also helps realize the look of Gotham. The film is very dark, just visually speaking, and often uses a very shallow depth of field. But you're always able to see clearly what you're meant to. It's not like Solo, a Star Wars story, or Army of the Dead, where the dark lighting or shallow depth of field is distracting and feels like it's used to hide bad visual effects or budget constraints. Everything obscured from the camera feels very intentional and adds to the sense of claustrophobia. It's also one of the only movies shot on digital that actually looks like it was shot on film. Whenever there's fake film grain in movies, it always looks incredibly fake to me, but with the Batman, if I didn't already know this was shot on digital, I would have assumed it was shot on film. The way the Batsuit is lit and framed, it just looks so downright cool. It looked like kind of a messy design based on set pictures, but in the film it just looks incredible. Speaking of Batman, Robert Pattinson killed it. Compared to all the previous Batman actors, his performance reminded me the most of Michael Keaton, where he's very reclusive and antisocial, and clearly doesn't interact with people that much. He even struggles to just look at people in the movie. Whenever he's out in public as Bruce Wayne, he's completely lost. I loved it. He hasn't yet developed a billionaire playboy persona of Bruce Wayne yet, which I think was a good decision for this specific movie. Although I do hope we get that down the line because it is one of my favorite aspects of the character. I really enjoyed this film's version of Commissioner Gordon quite a lot. Jeffrey Wright did a great job, and he plays off really well with Robert Pattinson. I also like how he sort of talks to Batman like he's a child. That's really interesting to me. Because in all likelihood, he probably thinks this guy who dresses like a bat is mentally unstable, and he is. The way he keeps calling him man, as if he's just continually reminding Batman that they're buddies, they're good friends, on good terms. At a certain point, it clicks that this is what's really going on. That Gordon is subtly talking down to him, as if he has to act like some kind of parental or teacher figure. And either Batman is just taking it, or genuinely doesn't realize it. I think that's such an interesting way to recontextualize Gordon and Batman's relationship. Or maybe I'm reading into it completely wrong, and Gordon does consider Batman to be his friend. But either way, you know Gordon thinks Batman is at least a bit of a weirdo. But he's probably too scared to say anything out of fear that Batman would freak out and no longer cooperate with the police. The only reason it seems like he's even willing to work with Batman is because he recognizes that he's trying to do the right thing, and he's good at beating people up and scaring off criminals. You also get a sense they've worked together for a while. The whole movie to me felt in many ways like a spiritual sequel to Batman Year One, but especially in Gordon and Batman's partnership. Just felt like a very natural progression from that comic specifically. That said, unlike in Year One and a lot of other Batman comics and movies, we never really get a sense of what Gordon's life is like beyond being a police commissioner. But I guess you don't really need that, at least for this movie. It's just something that I'm used to seeing with this character at this point, and probably because of that, you're able to notice that this incarnation doesn't portray that. I liked Zoe Kravitz as Selena Kyle slash Catwoman a lot. This is definitely the most comic accurate Catwoman we've gotten so far, at least from what I've read. Although it's hard not to compare her to Catwoman in Batman Returns. Because Batman and her have a pretty similar dilemma in this film, where she wants to kill a man who wronged her, and she believes he deserves it, and Batman is trying to stop her from crossing that line. And I have to admit, I found it more compelling in Returns than in this. Just because I found Catwoman more compelling of a character as well. I mean, Michelle Pfeiffer and Tim Burton's depiction of Catwoman, I would argue, is comparable to what Heath Ledger and Chris Nolan did with their version of the Joker. It's by far the most iconic version of that character. Even Anne Hathaway's Catwoman just felt like a more grounded version of the one we saw in Returns. Here, for the characterization, they just borrow from the comics, specifically Year One, which, it's good to get away from that other version of the character, but I think they shouldn't have given her such a similar motivation to what she had in Returns, because now I'm just thinking of that movie. I think if they gave her a different storyline, then I probably wouldn't be comparing her as much. But despite how she was used in the story, I still think Zoe Kravitz gave a great performance, and she had a very awkward chemistry with Robert Pattinson's Batman, which no doubt was intentional. But I still think they should have done something different with her character. Riddler, I think, made for a solid antagonist. He was threatening and mysterious at first, but once we find out who he really is and how he's just someone who's angry at the world, all of that goes away. It's really interesting, but I think they may have went a bit too far with that aspect of the character, because once we get to the interrogation scene, he no longer becomes threatening at all. Not just because we see he's ultimately just a loser, but because he's been defeated. He's in jail, and he's not even there during the final act. It's an interesting subversion, but I don't know if it completely worked for me. I might like this aspect better on rewatch though, I'm not sure. I think Riddler is definitely a one and done villain though, like his plan didn't work, he's in jail, and I don't see how in this grounded universe he'd be able to escape. I'm excited to see more of Barry Keoghan as the Joker, though, and hot take, I actually quite liked the deleted scene, and I think that maybe they should have left it in the movie. I think that would have improved the scene at the end, at least. It would have felt more like a payoff. Or I guess just have neither of those scenes in the movie. But you gotta set up sequels, I guess. I would be surprised if Riddler came back, though. I'm not sure how they'd make that work, but we'll see. I really love John Turturro as Carmine Falcone. He just perfectly encapsulated this sleazy crime boss. But he feels a lot more real and less over the top compared to the version seen in Batman Begins. In this, he's actually a human. The character who is over the top, though, but in all the best ways, is the Penguin, played by an unrecognizable Colin Farrell. My god, that makeup is just incredible. I mean, he's by far the most entertaining character in the movie. He's just so eccentric and manages to add a lot of humor to the film. He's such a larger than life character, and I can't wait to see more of him. Andy Serkis as Alfred, I liked, but I wish we got more of. But also at the same time, I understand why we didn't. This is Bruce Wayne's story, and for most of his life, he's been neglecting Alfred. I still wish we got to know his character a little bit more, but again, upon a rewatch, I might have my mind changed about this. Maybe I should have just rewatched this movie before making this review. I don't know. I like going off my first impressions though, but sometimes it's difficult when you feel conflicted about something, and you just know you'd feel more certain about it if you watch the movie again. But the movie's also 3 hours, and I ain't got all the time in the world. One thing I am quite certain about that I didn't like, however, was this movie felt like it was afraid to outright paint Thomas Wayne as a legitimately bad person. When Falcone explains to Bruce that he was hired to kill a journalist for him, I love that twist. I love how Bruce just has to grapple with the fact that his father, the person who inspired him to become Batman and fight crime, is actually just a criminal. But in the very next scene, Alfred is like, nah, that's not true, and straight up says, your father was a good man. And it's resolved just like that. That I was really not a big fan of. I've heard some people say that Bruce is hearing two different perspectives, so the truth probably lies somewhere in between, but I don't think the movie really communicated that well. I think the version of the story Bruce believed, and therefore the audience was meant to believe, was Alfred's. And from that, I don't think that Bruce Wayne was ever made to confront the worst parts of himself. As Batman, he has to learn to become a symbol of hope instead of fear, but as Bruce Wayne, he never considers that his wealth could help people who are struggling. But this is a story from Bruce Wayne's perspective, so it makes sense that he wouldn't be very critical of himself unless he's explicitly called out by characters in the movie. In one scene, he is confronted by a woman running for mayor of Gotham about how he's done very little with his money to make the city a better place, but Bruce is very dismissive of the conversation. He doesn't care. Bruce also notices that Selena Kyle is behind on rent and could be getting evicted, which is why she's turning to a life of crime, but never once does the movie ponder that, hey, Bruce could easily just help her out, because that's not what he's thinking about. The only way he knows to help the city is to dress up like a bat and beat up criminals, because he's mentally ill. Is that a hot take to say that Batman is definitely portrayed as being mentally ill in this movie? Anyway, I'm going to be optimistic and say that these are hints towards that happening, and we'll see Bruce Wayne's negligence explored more in the sequels. Honestly, the more I think about this movie, the more I like it, and there are little things I wish they changed or expanded on more, like being critical of Thomas Wayne and Bruce Wayne, because with this taking place in a realistic universe and not a fantastical universe that needs a Batman to protect people, these movies should have to come to terms with the fact that, in the real world, rich people are awful. And I'm not one of those people who hates the character of Batman because, oh, he's rich. Because he exists in a fantasy world full of superheroes and he's able to save people. But in this, it's more like our world. Which is why it feels a bit weird here, even though I'm cool with it with all the other Batman movies. And I think it is explored here somewhat, but I would like to see it taken further. Honestly, if the sequels explore more of what was hinted in this movie, I could see this turn into a trilogy that stands alongside or even rivals the Dark Knight trilogy. Overall, the Batman was pretty great, but you know that already. I'm not sure if I loved it as much as everyone else. I didn't find it perfect, but I love the filmmaking on display, and I love this depiction of Gotham and Bruce Wayne, and I can't wait to see more of this universe. I'm giving the Batman an 8.5 out of 10. So glad I finally got this review out. I really hope it's not too late. Oh shit, Doctor Strange just came out, and now the Batman is irrelevant. Anyway, that's what I thought about the Batman. Thanks for watching, really appreciate it. If you want, you can follow me on Twitter at CinemaGeekYT, leave a like, and subscribe for more videos like this one.